Thank you much, Alison. The next presenter is Davy Mellado, and the title of his presentation is A Bias Guide to Life or the Stimulation of Andragogic Discourse in Contemporary America.
Hi, my name is Davy Mellado. I'm a recent graduate of the Johns Hopkins MLA program, and my capstone is entitled A Bias Guide to Life, or the Stimulation of Andragogic Discourse in Contemporary America. Now, the impact of bias on our perspectives is widely recognized. It's often acknowledged that bias in news outlets leads viewers to become more divisive and polarized, and it's not going anywhere in our new forms of media. Current algorithms used in AI-generated art and ChatGPT also contain biases. For example, Stable Diffusion, an AI art generator, consistently generates images of Caucasian individuals when the word beautiful is entered, failing to show any diversity for that term unless you specifically request it. But this is probably no surprise to anyone. Bias has, perhaps subliminally, what people believe to be the root of dozens of societal issues. But this is, in fact, a bias in and of itself. Giving yourself a process to understand and empathize with the biases that we all hold may be the key to reducing the countless moment-to-moment interactions. This requires 3 steps. Destigmatizing the term bias, recognizing that everyone, in particular mature adult brains, have the ability to change their beliefs. And then third, establishing what I call empathetic bias relativism. Biases affect almost every moment of our lives. They could be positive, like your all-time favorite ice cream, or negative, like avoiding moving to a nice neighborhood just because there are not as many people that look like you. But ever since the dawn of modernism, our attitudes have almost always been negative. Herbert Spencer, a 19th century philosopher who actually coined the term survival of the fittest, once said, "The bias of education, class relationship, nationality, politics, theology, these added to the constitutional sympathies and apathies have much more influence in determining beliefs than have the actual small amount of actual evidence connected." This may sound like an accepted fact about the world, but there's a problem in accepting this quote as sociological law. Spencer's dictating a law that humans are unable to evenly weigh any evidence, reason, or truth against the biases we carry. I believe that may be where we are, but not where we could be. And on top of this, it is scientifically unclear if mature adult brains can even change long-term established thoughts, patterns, and implement new knowledge. Recent research has revealed that neurons exhibit a phenomenon where growth of some of the neurons leads to the receding of the ones around it, causing a weakness of nuanced perception of a belief. Now, these neurons, which become stronger when compared to others in the neural pathway, express structural long-term potentiation with the live target stimulus, or what we're considering the belief. This is where we develop a lot of our biases within a regimented belief system that could start when we're children, or it could start when our brains mature as adults. For example, an adult might always avoid dogs because they were bit by one once when they were a kid. Or an adult ignoring news entirely from one news source because the news channel that they watch more consistently demonizes that one. And this could happen when they're as an adult. Now, producing neurological trenches to only seek information from one news source seems to be the result. There doesn't seem to be a happy ending here. We're all told that we all have biases and they're either bad or they're unchangeable, and many times both. It is also true that implicit bias trainings have become mainstream, but they have become ineffective. Incorporating classes, schools, businesses, and police forces across the country, there's actually very little evidence that these are making long-term goals or long-term change. Now, what if the current trend of implementing these classes have a goal beyond making the world a better place? Well, the human experience includes what's called an evolutionary negative bias, which means that individuals are less motivated by incentives than to avoid any losses. This means we're naturally inclined to believe a stove will burn us, as opposed to the potential of cooking a meal. The reward of creating a better world pales in comparison to the fear of being considered biased. And yet, almost everyone here has used an oven to make ourselves a meal. So we were able to change what we were biased and conditioned from evolution to believe. And this is what's called a belief change, a psychological term describing a moment where we adopt new ideology, forgoing our previous psychological training. And what is a belief? Well, Dr. Ralph Lewis, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, defines it as energy-saving shortcuts in modeling and predicting the environment. You see a dark cave, and your mental shortcut of fearing an attack by something instantly kicks in. You see a dear friend, and your mental shortcut to feel happy and safe kicks in. This is actually an example of when a bias not only becomes a necessary trait, but one what we are proud to have that makes our lives exponentially better. Empathetic bias relativism. This is achieved via a simple framework. Recontextualize, understand the impact, and empathize with yourself and others in this journey. This is the beginning of balancing the scales of what influences our thinking. Truth and bias. Now let's walk through what each of these mean for us. Bias was commonly used either in a positive or neutral context in the 13th and 14th century. It wasn't around until the 16th century that it evolved into a similar negative use that we have today. Now, believe it or not, Shakespeare was one of the first who invented this new use of bias as a trait of the gullible or the manipulative, as he did in Hamlet. So this is a quote actually describing this exactly. "See you now. Your bait of falsehood takes this carp of truth, and thus do we of wisdom and reach with windlasses and with essays of bias. By indirections, find directions out." Essentially saying that we can use biases to swindle people to tell us the truth that we want. Now, before this point, most people used it as a descriptor of a specific trend. One was among dressmakers, when they cut along what they called the bias or the warp of the fabric. They discovered it would produce better results. In order to make a good dress, the consideration and the understanding of the fiber's tendencies is required. Another definition refers to woodmaking and how making a bias was an oblique cut, leaning cut that favors a specific direction. We often don't realize that sometimes a piece of wooden furniture is beautiful due to the asymmetrical design, and would never consider it a professional woodmaker's cut ugly if it happens to include a designed bias. A particularly useful imagery is considering flowers. Flowers are biased towards the sun. If you face it away from a window, they will move over in a couple of days or so in order to face that sunlight. Now, by no means am I suggesting that all biases are good and should be acted upon. Simply that the presence of bias is not good or bad, and they can be altered. This is part of a larger discourse examining andragogy, or the ability for a mature adult brain to learn new concepts. I'm sure you're familiar with the common phrase about older individuals being stuck in their ways. The agnostic conversation people often have when referring to the newfangled lifestyle of the young compared to the good old days. However, this is no more than a common idiom. Jonas Dalgay, a postdoctoral researcher at the Santa Fe Institute, studied belief change and how it can be activated with dissonance, which is our ability to hold conflicting opinions while we contemplate. Dalgay discovered that individuals with higher belief-specific dissonance were more likely to change their beliefs compared to individuals with low belief-specific dissonance. In other words, when you perceive topics as less black and white and engage in more gray thinking, you are more likely to change your beliefs if your previous thinking was in fact flawed. And this dissonance was not correlated with age at all. It was random. Some other older individuals had a lot, and some younger had just a little bit. But what trumps it all is one's ability to be empathetic towards others and oneself. The empathetic element of empathetic bias relativism plays a huge role. Individuals who practice empathizing with others who are feeling the same insecurity, shame, or dissonance they're experiencing have been shown to reduce negative biases. Scholar Kayla Gomez did a study on the connection between participants' empathy and their explicit biases. This study was done with a police force interacting with individuals with mental challenges and the implicit and explicit biases they carried about them. She discovered a correlation: when empathy increases, explicit biases decrease. But are there any ways we can predictably change our biases? Lee Kirkpatrick, a professor in psychology, created an intervention process successfully reducing attentional biases in depressed individuals. Now, attentional biases refer to the difficulty in focusing on other important factors when in a depressive state. In other words, a depressed individual engaging in binge eating has a hard time considering the stomach issues that will result from their actions later on. And what has made this intervention so different is that it taught the participants that biases are inherently neutral, not only negative. And furthermore, that bias is just like a habit. It can be altered with understanding, training, and, you guessed it, empathy. Lasting belief change also requires empathy for oneself. When we reduce our past selves to being a villain, we set ourselves up for less dissonance and encourage black and white thinking, producing deeper psychological biases against ourselves. It causes us to refuse the notion that there could be good that happened during the dark time in our lives. But that's simply not the truth. No chapter of a person's life is entirely without productive intentions. This is why I consider empathy as the driver of nuance. To wrap this up, the majority of people in contemporary America still perceive bias as a negative trait. But establishing a common empathy with others and ourselves as we struggle to reduce negative biases or encourage positive biases can very well give us the ability to alter our interpersonal relationships entirely, reducing the likelihood of polarized stances, us versus them mentalities, or ostracizing our loved ones. I see the introduction of this concept of empathetic bias relativism working in the form of a documentation of one's inner struggle with biases and using a neutral perspective in order to address all sorts of biases in one life. I'm currently producing this documentation in the form of a book describing honest reactions to my own biases and the resulting dissonance that ensues in a comical and somewhat insightful way. The title of this book, A Bias Guide to Life, includes a double entendre. At first, it reads as an ignorant manual on how the reader should live their life, but by the end, they realize that bias is a guide for us to become more understanding of others, accepting of ourselves, and how to grow our empathy to make a better world.